I grew up, no, I lived in London for the first 3 or 4 years of my life, and then we moved down to Petworth in about 52, and then my great uncle died in that year, and he had no children, so my father was his heir, and we then moved into Petworth House about 2 years later in about 1954. We lived in a house in the town for about 2 years, and then we moved into Petworth House in 1954. I can barely remember my time in London, I remember it. And then we moved down here, and it all seemed completely natural. This was just the way that life was. I even imagined that perhaps everybody lived like this.
Yeah, I suppose as a child you do.
You do, yes. I had my little kingdom, you see. I used to play in the garden. I had a brother and a sister, but I'm 4 years older than my sister, and I'm 10 years older than my brother. So we get on terribly well now, and I was very close to my sister during the time that I was growing up. But it was a bit like having 3 only children, because there was a lot in between us, many years between us.
And the school here was the one that had the bomb in the Second World War.
Yes, that was a great tragedy for the town. I still remember that. A lot of people lost brothers and sons.
There's quite a lot killed, weren't there? I can't remember the number now.
I think 30-something.
Yeah.
It was terrible, and the teacher was killed. No, it was a terrible tragedy. I didn't go to a primary school. I had a governess who taught me here, and then I was sent off at the age of 8 to a boarding school, the first time I'd ever left home.
And which school was that?
It was a school called Heatherdown.
No.
It was near Ascot.
And you stayed there until you were 18?
Stayed there until I was 13, and then I went to Eton after that.
Well, what was Eton like?
Well, I enjoyed my first school enormously. I wasn't apprehensive about going away from here. I was a bit lonely here. And I went to Heatherdown at the age of 8, and I discovered that I was able to make friends and to get on with people, and it was a wonderful experience, all that. And it was a nice school, and the headmaster was a nice man, and the teachers were nice. It was a good atmosphere. Eton I found more challenging. It didn't suit me particularly. I went through a turbulent time in adolescence, and so I don't have such happy memories of that. And then I was at Oxford, where I was happy.
And Oxford, was that?
Oxford I liked very much, yeah. That was great. That was like a liberation to me after school.
So you would have been there in the...
I went up in 1967 and I left in 1970.
Yeah. What did you study at Oxford?
I studied history.
Oh, very good. That's a wise choice.
Yes.
What's your era?
Well, I've written about different eras. I've written primarily about the late Victorian and the Edwardian age, and also the early 20th century and even the late 20th century. So my period might be said to begin in about 1870 and go on to the present day, I suppose.
In what way was the house different then compared to now, or has it remained constant?
Well, it was different in a way because there was no central heating. So my parents installed that. That was the first thing they did.
So it was open fires, was it?
Open fires, and if the fire was not lit, it was very, very cold indeed. And so they installed heating. They installed some more bathrooms, and we changed the southern end of the house in the early years of the 21st century by adding on the terrace here, we can see, which means that you can come straight out of the south end into the garden, which you couldn't do before. But the house is open to the public, obviously, and that's a very good thing. And the park is open to the public every day. And so we have the public over the wall, over there, and we have the town on the other side, but we're extremely lucky we have the privacy of our garden here, and we can now come directly out into the garden from the south end of the house, which we couldn't do before. So I suppose that is the great change that we've made and has happened in my lifetime.
And this part is your private part?
We live in about a third of the house, yes, and the rest is open to the public almost every day of the year now, which is excellent, because my family gave the house to the National Trust just after the war.
In your great uncle's time, what would have been the relationship between him and the town? Would it be, in what way was it different from now?
Well, in those days it was very different because the house and the estate completely dominated the town, really, and was a huge employer. We employ people now, but not nearly as many people as we did then. And the estate owned a lot of the town. It still owns a bit of it, but not as much as it did. And so it was the house and the town were a combination, but the house was the dominant feature.
And have you still got families working here now who were working
Yes,
generations ago?
we have. We've got certain people from certain families that have been on the estate for very many years.
Well, that's quite remarkable.
Yes,
isn't it?
it's wonderful. Yes.
And how many people do you employ now?
We
Then?
employ about 60 people.
And what would it have been then?
Oh, many hundreds.
Yeah, gosh.
Mm.
Yeah.
After my great uncle died in 1952, in order to pay at least a proportion of the taxes, we traded in quite a lot of the art collection. All the Turners, for instance, there were 20 Turners here, and they still are here, but then they're no longer my family's. We traded them into the nation.
Right.
But we've still got some of the collection, and we've still got the estate around here, the land around here, although we don't own the house and the park.
Which is National Trust?
Yes,
yeah.
National Trust.
So what land do you own then, apart from the outside? Well, you don't own the park, but
No, well, we've got
agricultural land.
Yes, agricultural land, exactly.
And how's the management of that land changed?
Well, I have an agent who helps me look after that, and we have a farm manager. We have a farm, not a very big farm now, it used to be much bigger, and I have advisors who help me. I have a forester who looks after the woodlands.
So how big is what is the extent of that?
The extent
holding?
of the estate, well, it's still surprisingly big. It's about 13,000 acres, 13,500 acres.
So you've got farmland, you've got woodland.
Yes.
So the actual farming, the actual use of that land, how is that? Altered?
We let it to tenants, to tenant farmers.
But in terms of what's produced on it?
Wheat, dairy, corn, a variety of stuff.
So have those proportions altered?
Yes, they have changed. When I was growing up here, there were a lot of small dairy farms where people used to milk about 20 cows or something. That's all gone completely. There are far fewer dairy farms than there used to be, and more growing of crops, more growing of wheat, primarily wheat. We used to own a common called Egremont Common, and they have that now, and they look after it very, very well.
The Egremont Horn Fair.
Yes, yes.
Every year we say must go to the Egremont Horn
Yes.
Fair. And never, ever been.
Yes, I present the horns generally to the winning batsman.
Is it going to happen this year?
No, not this year, sadly.
It's
It's the first
definitely-
year for years it hasn't happened.
So your great uncle, he had the two titles, did he? Lord Egremont.
He
and
was Lord
Leconfield?
Leconfield, yes.
He was just Leconfield.
Yeah, he was just Leconfield, yes.
So why was that then?
Well, my father was made Lord Egremont for the work that he did for Harold Macmillan. He was Harold Macmillan's private secretary, and he was created Lord Egremont in the early 1960s. So that brought the title into the family again. There'd always been an Egremont title, but it died out. But then my father revived it. My father inherited this place in 1952. He had enormous death duties to cope with too. But he continued to work for Macmillan, so he was up in London a lot of the time, and he died in 1972. So he didn't really have a long time continuously down here, because Macmillan ceased to be the Prime Minister in 1963. Then my father started going to the House of Lords and was occupied with that, and then he died in 1972.
Yes. So if we can go back to that time when you inherited, that must have been quite an overwhelming experience, I would
Well,
imagine.
it took me out of my, I suppose you might say, it took me out of my generation, because all my friends were working and starting jobs in different parts of the world, different parts of the country, at a very junior level. They were very young, and I suddenly found myself in charge, ostensibly, of this huge project down here, and I was only 24. I'd imagined that my father would live for years and
Of
years.
course.
I'd imagined that I would have a career in London or wherever, and then eventually come and live down here, but not until I was in my 50s or in my 60s even, because we're quite long-lived as a family.
Right, yes, yes.
And then he got cancer.
Cancer.
Died when he was...
So you had the grief of losing your father and then taking this on.
And then taking this on, yes, exactly, and dealing with the death duty bill. I'm not complaining about that at all, because I think it's quite right that if you're rich you should pay taxes, but we had to discover a way of doing it.
And how, so suddenly here's a 24-year-old having to be in charge of people who've been probably working here for
Yes,
decades.
they were all unbelievably nice to me, and I'd known a lot of them since I was a child, and they helped. I couldn't have possibly done it without them. I mean, they helped me and they taught me so much. I learned so much from them.
Your great uncle he was here for a long time then.
He was
50
here
years
for
or
a long
something.
time. Yes, he was. He was Lord Lieutenant. He was the chairman of the county council, and he ran the estate too. And he was very keen on hunting. That was how he'd spent a lot of his time.
Because this was quite a famous hunt, wasn't it?
Yes, called the Leconfield Hunt. Yes, absolutely. And it was a private hunt until the 1930s. Then it became a subscription pack. And it still exists. It's a part of 3 hunts were merged, the Chiddingfold, the Leconfield and the Cowdray. It's now called the Chiddingfold, Leconfield and Cowdray.
It was a huge social thing,
Oh,
wasn't it?
tremendously. Even in my youth, in my childhood, in the 50s, it was important around here. People looked upon it as being a very, very serious activity. It was not something you took lightly.
And it involved all stratas of society,
It
didn't it? One
involved
level?
all stratas, but in a very stratified way. Everybody had their position.
So tell us a bit about that. That sounds quite
Well,
interesting.
there was the master, obviously, who was very important, and then there was the huntsman. Sometimes the master used to hunt the hounds himself. Sometimes it would be the professional huntsman who was paid to hunt the hounds. And then there'd be a whole society from the earth stoppers who stopped the earth to prevent the foxes getting down the earths and getting away. There was the terrier man. It was a vast organisation, huge. And it was talked about a lot. It was a hugely significant part of the county life.
And that would have been the winter months, would it?
That would have been the winter, exactly.
Because I think in the House of Commons, the whips, the chief whip, all comes from the hunt terms, the whipper in.
I think it does, exactly. Yes, it does, absolutely. Well, that's all slightly faded now, of course.
Yes. So how do they operate now then?
Well, they have a drag hunt now, effectively. They have a trail, and the hounds charge after the trail, and the followers follow. So there's not the art that there used to be of trying to find the fox and to get the hounds onto it. It was a real art.
So there's obviously there's a levelling then, isn't there, compared to previous generations?
Yes, I think there probably is. I think the class differences in the 50s were very great, yes. They probably are still there, certainly, but not to such an obvious way, probably, as they used to be.
And the people we went to interview before we came here, these 2 chaps at Stedham
Oh, yes.
with the Sussex accent, well, of course, you hardly hear that now.
Hardly. In my youth, there were people here who you couldn't understand. And we've got a property up in Cumbria, and I used to go for a walk around that, and there was a way that used to lead me back to Cockermouth, which is the name of the town. And there was one house where, on the edge of the town, lived in by this old man, and I used to think to myself, oh, I do hope he doesn't come out and speak to me, because I won't be able to understand a single word he says. And he used to come out, and he used to like to engage me at enormous length, and I couldn't understand a single word. And he would stop at the end of one sentence. I'd say, oh, really, was it? That's interesting. And then he'd go off again, and then he'd stop, and then I'd say, oh, yes, I didn't realise that. And he was an amazing man. He was a wonderful man, but that was the last of the dialect generation. And we had a dictionary. There's a dictionary here, a dictionary of the Sussex dialect, and there's a dictionary up in Cumbria called the Dictionary of the Cumbrian Dialect. I used to consult that when I came back from talking to him, and occasionally I would be able to work out more or less what he'd been saying.
Even in Sussex, though, the dialect words, no one would be able to understand them unless they knew the word.
No, but it was such a pretty dialect to hear them speak. It was so wonderful. Some dialects, the Birmingham dialect is not particularly beautiful, but the Sussex one was particularly attractive, I always thought.
Do any of the people who work here still keep the accent?
Not so much, a bit. Not so much as they used to. No.
It's become Londonised, I suppose.
I suppose so, yes. When I started writing, one of the first books I wrote was about Arthur Balfour, the Edwardian Prime Minister. And I started doing research for that just after my father died, really, because I gave up my job in London. I worked for a publishing firm, and I came down here and I had to look after the estate and cope with the taxes, but I was determined to do something else as well that would take me away from here, and I thought it would make my life here a bit easier. I wouldn't become too enclosed. So I decided to write. I had the time to write, and I could make a timetable for myself in my day when I could do the estate work at a certain time and do my writing at another time. And I wrote a life of Arthur Balfour, the Edwardian Prime Minister, and I started doing research for that in the late 1970s, and there were a lot of people around who remembered him and who remembered the pre-1914 time, because Balfour didn't die until the late 1920s.
He was quite an intellectual, wasn't he?
Yes, he was, yes.
And
yes, he was a philosopher.
And I remember there was some woman, I can't remember her name, who was quite an important figure in her day, and she said to him, we should be married, and he said, no, I want a career of my own.
Yes, yes, absolutely. That was Margot Asquith.
Oh, it's Margot Asquith.
Yes,
Margot right, of course.
Yes, and he was always thought to be a very cold man, and somebody said to him, you would mind if... You wouldn't really... He said to him, now you like Joe, and you like Fred, and you like whoever it is, but you're not really particularly fond of us. You wouldn't really mind if we died, would you? And he thought, and he said, I should mind if you all died on the same day. It was rather clever answer.
And I don't think someone of that intellectual
I didn't particularly like him. So the book came out and it did all right. But then I wrote a life of Siegfried Sassoon, whom I liked enormously and felt enormous sympathy with, and he was a very good poet, and I was very interested in what he did in the First World War. And he'd been a fox hunting man too. He wrote marvellous books about hunting, and I enjoyed that much more. I wrote 4 novels. So I've written all sorts of things.
Excellent.
And then I wrote a book about East Prussia, which is partly travel, partly history.
And that which is now Poland, I suppose, is it?
Poland and the western part of Russia, a strange enclave of Russia called Kaliningrad, which used to be the German Königsberg until 1945.
You mentioned about, of course, the bypass, which must have been quite traumatic, because there was a serious proposal, wasn't there, to build it through the park?
There was. I fought that, but the National Trust was magnificent. They took on the county council and the people who wanted to put the road through the park, and if it hadn't been for them, I think the park would have been in grave danger. It might easily have happened.
Yes.
Because the money was there then. There seemed to have been much more money about then.
Local government was still brimming with confidence.
It seemed to be, yes. It seemed to be. I mean, I remember being taken down to County Hall and being shown the County Council's architecture department, a vast building, stuffed with these people drawing up plans to put road through parks and through places where they shouldn't go.
And there was an alternative through the Shimmins Valley, wasn't
Yes,
there?
that was equally bad.
That was equally as bad.
Terrible.
And then there was the tunnel option.
But the
which,
tunnel
of
was
course,
the
would cost
worst of all, of course.
And it would have
I
cost
mean,
a
one
fortune.
bad, it was like a series of explosions somehow. There'd be a big explosion, you think, well, that's the last explosion, you know, putting it through the park. Then there'd be another big explosion, the Shimmings Valley, they can't. No. And then the tunnel through the park. It was completely insane.
Yeah. And I remember, because I was on the county council when the current system that they've got of directing traffic
Yes.
came along, and I remember on the planning committee, and people were going to go, well, why didn't anyone think of this 20 years ago?
It was thought of by the local butcher.
Yeah, you said, I didn't realise
Bert
that.
Speed,
Marvellous.
who was
yeah.
a great man, a really great man. And there were all these great bureaucrats and these vast departments of planning and transport. Here was this one man who solved it all, and he wasn't even employed by the county council.
And is it still, obviously traffic is increasing all the time.
Yes, but the roads around are much better now. You see, the A27's been improved enormously. A3 is much better. You've got the Hindhead Tunnel. So not so much traffic comes into Petworth as it used to.
That's good. And what about looking forward then? How do you see the estate evolving?
Well, I think the great excuse for estates like this is that they honour a certain code, that they look after the land, that they're not only thinking of deriving a huge amount of money out of it, but they're thinking of the long-term future of the land as well. And this particularly applies, of course, to woodland, where you have to think in terms of decades when you decide to plant. And so I hope that we can prove our worth by continuing with that. And one of the wonderful things that's happened, I happen to think that the world's got much better in my lifetime. And one of the wonderful things that's happened is this great new interest in the environment and the greener world. And I think that this is something that landowners have a huge part to play in. And we've got to respect that, and we should respect it.
Up at Knepp, they've done this rewilding.
Yes, they have. Yes, I haven't done that.
You haven't thought of doing that?
No. I admire them very much. You know, they're terrific people, but I haven't done that here, no.
But have there been changes recently to management?
Well, it's much, people are much more careful about the land now than they used to be, certainly. And the eyes of the world are much more on us now, because it's very easy to discover what's going on a place like this. When I was growing up here in the 50s, this was quite a remote part of England. Not many people came here.
No.
So you could get away with all sorts of things if you wanted to. You can't do that now.
No. Which I suppose is a good thing.
Yeah, I think so.